friends, and a warm welcome back to Intersections. Our focus here is on dissolving boundaries as a way for us to expand our consciousness and discover more, the unlimited possibilities that lie in arm's reach if we were only open to creating intersections between what otherwise seem to be seemingly disparate parts of life and the universe. Today's guest, Gregory Khalil, who I will introduce in a moment, is a perfect example of somebody who's striving to do this dissolution of boundaries, this dissolving of boundaries across some of the most, seemingly intractable problems and chasms of our time, some of the most polarized positions of our time. And therefore, we have so much to learn about the possibilities that lie in front of us for, in fact, taking even those parts of our social space, our humanity, and our personal space that we feel like the twain could never meet. Those two things could just never meet, and see what Greg has to say about how to bring them together. Greg is an adjunct assistant professor of journalism at the Columbia School of Journalism here in New York. He is the co-founder and president of Telos, a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit that focuses on equipping American leaders and their communities to better engage seemingly intractable conflict issues. Much of his work has centered on the role of faith leaders and culture shapers in America's relationship with Israel-Palestine and the broader Middle East. Prior to founding Telos, he was a legal and communications advisor to Palestinian leaders on peace negotiations with Israel. He is also a founding member and chair of the board of directors of Narrative 4, a global nonprofit that seeks to use story and media to cultivate empathy across divides. Greg has lectured internationally and has written extensively in leading media, including the New York Times and the Review of Faith and International Affairs. Thank you, Greg, for joining us. Great to have you here with us today. Where are you today?
I'm in South America. I'm in Argentina, in Mendoza, in the Andes Mountains.
How does it feel to be there? I have long had a desire to want to travel to that part of the world. Haven't had a chance to yet, but how does it feel to be in Argentina?
It's exciting. It's a moment of real transition here. It's a country I'm getting to know a little bit better because of my in-laws and family down here. So here for the holidays. But it's a fascinating culture. And right now, like many countries in the world, Argentina is going through real transformation with a new libertarian leader, President Milei. I don't know enough about Argentina's history to comment with real authority on it, but I do know what I've witnessed over the past few years, and things feel quite different than they did when I was here last year at this time.
In positive ways or just different?
I think in both. I think, Argentina's long had a problem with runaway inflation, the highest inflation rates in the world. Milei has tamed that down. And so that's something that I think affects everyone's life, that you can go to the supermarket one day and know that the price of milk is going to be the same tomorrow, which it wasn't when I was here before. It was just absolutely shocking. There was an alternate sort of money market, the blue market, that's pretty much dried up over the last year. And then there's concerns about sort of these economic shocks and the rise in poverty, because many people who were already poor are paying some of the costs, supposedly, of these reforms. I don't know enough about the data to comment with authority, but the people that I speak to tend to welcome sort of this end to runaway inflation and are both hopeful and fearful about what's to come. But that's been something that's universally seen as a positive and in just a year's time.
Wow. Yeah. No, thank you for sharing. I've been getting whiffs of this just from the news media. You're, I think, observing it in closer hands. And I think in some ways it speaks to the signs of our times, the idea that there are some very important, seemingly intractable issues that do need attention, that do need, decisive sort of energy and focus. And some of them will require, sacrifices and, some level of risk-taking and boldness, and won't be easy. And somehow society will have to come together to find its way to move, to the other side of the bridge. It seems like, all of that, which we really need in humanity at large across so many sectors and regions, is what you're seeing and bearing witness to in Argentina. And what brought me and you together first was on the Columbia campus, as on many campuses, we have been witnessing a growing tension at times that arises in the classroom and on campus. And professors have at times suddenly felt way out of the comfort zone in what to do with it, how to deal with it. And so there was this program that the office of the president and the provost put together around dialogues across differences as a way to help faculty, get trained in how to deal with these situations. And that is when I first met you, because you and a faculty collaborator of yours, Professor Ari Goldman, also from the School of Journalism, were coming together to share your perspective on how to not just kind of, in some just like awkward way deal with a situation like that, but to actually intentionally lean into it and almost to like invite a space where those very things which many faculty would like to shove under the rug could actually be brought into sharp relief and grappled with and dealt with. And that's a class that Ari and you teach together. Could we start there? Could you talk about what is the main thesis of that class? What is the main goal of that class? And how did Ari and you come together to teach it?
Sure. I mean, there was a lot of interesting themes in just that one question, but the short answer is that our class is called Covering Religion. We are a graduate seminar in the journalism school, and the whole purpose of the class is to equip young, ambitious journalists with the skills to write about complex issues that intersect with religion, faith, and the public square effectively. This is a topic that I come from a very liberal background. Many from my background want to, be in a world beyond faith. They see faith as sort of this vestigial organ of the human species that is somehow, it's magical thinking. But it is a feature of our shared experience, whatever you think. And I think what you see in many media is that there's a lack of religious literacy. So many issues like here in the United States, well, here at least metaphorically, where we're both based, the media misses a lot of big stories because of their lack of literacy around faith, not as sort of, what do I believe or what are the tenets of Islam or Judaism or Hinduism or Christianity, but because of a lack of awareness of how faith intersects and shapes social movements, including political movements. So, for example, the big story that everyone missed in the 2016 presidential election in the US was the role of faith communities in electing President Donald Trump to the surprise victory. And now everybody knows this is obvious. One of the big stories that I've worked on my entire life, I happen to also be Palestinian. I was born and raised in the States. I come from a Palestinian Christian community, the oldest Christian community in the world. I've lived back and forth in the States and in Palestine and traveled to Israel, Palestine well over 150 times. Is sort of the role of faith in shaping that conflict over the last 100 years, as well as American politics and even British politics. It's the Holy Land, after all. Yeah, and so, in looking in the public square and the conversations we were having around this seemingly intractable conflict, which unfortunately has just disintegrated into horrific proportions, unimaginable suffering today, particularly in Gaza, that threatens all Israelis and Palestinians, the region, and I would argue the world, and I'm sure we'll get into that more. That's another issue in which this dimension was missing. So long story short, about 7 years ago, Ari needed a guest speaker for this class covering religion that he'd been teaching for many years to equip young journalists to write with nuance around these complex issues in the public square. And he had heard about me and my work, and he wanted me to come in and speak around through the role of certain communities on the ground in Israel, Palestine. And we got to know each other, and then he asked me surprisingly to co-teach the class with him as an adjunct because of a lot of experience that I have with the media, with Israel, Palestine, with faith communities around the world, and with some other issues. And so 7 years ago, we joined forces, and that led us to you that one day after things started to fall apart on Columbia's campus.
You talk about how the media misses so many interesting stories, important stories about religion. one of the, I want to come back to, your journey in that class and beyond in just a couple of moments, but just to build on that, one of the stories I think it is missing today, and I want to test this thought with you, is that in general, we have put religion on the sidelines of our modern society in the way we really approach education and organizational life and generally, the liberal social order. And I think the reason for that is because in the past, religion has been extremely divisive and, at times led to violent outcomes of, one faith seeking to dominate over another in terms of the institutions and the kings and others who were, wanting to kind of ascend in some ways. And while painfully so, that continues to be true in certain pockets and parts of the world, one of which is what you've just talked about and highlighted in Israel, Palestine. It's also true that when I look at sort of the blessedness of somewhat more of a peaceability that we have in a modern day democratic society like America, again, a little bit strained in present times, but, broadly that is the case, that what I find is that there are people today of faith, Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus and beyond, who are comfortable sitting in their pews and temples and beyond. At the same time, while they have a deep affinity for their faith and their community and their scripture and their prophet, etc., they're also very much appreciative, of people of other faiths. Sometimes their daughter is married to somebody in another faith. Sometimes, they come to work and they find people there of all faiths and they love many of those people. They find them to be very kindred in spirit in terms of the values and all of that. And as a result, to the extent that there is still some preaching going on in perhaps in some communities of worship that claims or suggests that our prophet is the only prophet and our path to truth is the only right path to truth. I think I'm noticing a number of individuals who are taking that part of what is happening in their faith communities in from one ear and out from the other, because they just don't believe that anymore. They're very happy and appreciative and trusting that people can be well-intentioned on other faiths, traditions, and paths and making their own way up, whatever that mountaintop is of human potential and connection to the divine. And I don't see media really honoring and reviewing and storytelling around that groundswell of almost like interfaith communities that are informally starting to happen in our, and as a result, we continue to suppress this instinct of wanting to open ourselves up for these kinds of more mystical or divine or God-oriented conversations because we feel shy of doing that, thinking it'll lead to divisions. And it will in certain cases of fundamentalist belief systems. But there's just a liberal order that is starting to arise in faith communities too, which may or may not be institutionalized yet, but it's certainly there in the informal spaces that I've sought to explore and create, like the one that you and I are having today.
Well, I think it's true, and I think it's part of the story. So this is something I know to be true from personal experience and from the conversation that we're having today. It's also true from the data, and particularly among younger people, that there's more curiosity, particularly in the United States and in other parts of the world, around sort of more expansive views of faith. And when you poll some people about it, they tend to indicate that sometimes they may define themselves as a particular religion, but when you dive more deeply into what their actual beliefs are about that faith, they may have a more expansive view on how they relate to the other, the religious other, the non-religious other, than many interpretations of their faith might have you believe. I also think it's true that people tend to be more curious. And so I'm going to go into some more difficult data and perspectives in a second, but I do, we're leading with hinting at some quite divisive issues and some horrific realities, like in ongoing, what I would call, and most experts would call, an ongoing genocide in Gaza, that we need to address. But if we're looking, I want to start with this point of departure, is that most people, even quite devout people in their particular faith tradition or their particular political worldview, are in fact curious. Most people are just like you, and they're just like me. We have really well-formed opinions about things, and we take our beliefs seriously, and so we act on them. And a lot of these issues that we term as divisive in in the world, we end up falling on one side or the other, but it doesn't mean that we're necessarily there comfortably, or that we're not open to learning. And what's missing in the world is a space for curiosity and a space for deep engagement and a space for people who have not had the ability to experience the reality or the perspective of others to do that, I think. But at the same time, I said that this part of the story that you articulated is true. There are other true stories too.
Right.
We're living in a moment of unparalleled lived uncertainty for much of the world. Because what's happening in Argentina, where I am today, is sort of a decade's an upheaval that hasn't been seen for decades. And we've seen the data on religiosity in the public square very clear. So at the same time as there's been this trend towards an openness, in America, in the United States, it's called the nuns, people who tend to be spiritual, but actually, in fact, don't affiliate with any religious tradition whatsoever. It's the largest sort of growing segment among younger Americans in sort of terms of religiosity. We're also seeing an entrenchment. So one group that I've done a lot of work with and study around, and I say group because it's a very loose term, are evangelicals. Even the definition of what it means to be evangelical in America is hotly contested. But whatever definition you look at, it's true that many people particularly sense the rise of Trumpism as a force in America, have left evangelicalism as evangelical has become associated with the political movement of Trump. But it's also true, just, most recent data was 2% no longer defined as evangelicals, but 6% of Americans now define as evangelical, in part because of Trumpism. So there's this reverse trend that you see in the States of people becoming, in fact, more religious. On that specific data, what's fascinating is you dive into it and you ask them specific questions related to faith. And often people who now newly define as evangelical don't go to church and don't hold some of what sociologists would define as the core beliefs of evangelicalism broadly conceived. Now, we're seeing these trends around the world. We're seeing trends to actually, in Latin America, to much more sort of dogmatic forms of religion. We're seeing in the United States, for example, among minority groups like Latino Americans who many come from Catholic backgrounds but are espousing sort of like evangelical beliefs. We see throughout the global South in sub-Saharan Africa a rise in religiosity and expressions of religiosity that are not ecumenical as sort of you laid out. And I think there are a number of potential sociological reasons to explore for this. I definitely don't have all the answers. I don't think anybody does, but I do think it's both it's both a result and a cause of this rising uncertainty that we see in the world. One last thing, I just want to bring this back to Israel-Palestine, is that, we're talking a lot about faith and religiosity right now, but oftentimes with religion, it's not about religion. Israel-Palestine, for example, is not a religious conflict. The term conflict is hotly contested too, as we can go into momentarily, but it's about land. It's about power. And religion is often used and fuels different sort of tribal perspectives about who we are and who has a right to be here. But people aren't sitting debating about interpretations over religious text or my religion is better than yours and therefore, and people say this, but that's not what's driving Israel-Palestine and what's driving so many other conflicts in the world that are often talked about in highly religious terms is the quest for power.
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a powerful commentary. I would actually love to provide some sources and references to our listeners on some of these studies that are really defining kind of the current demographic trends, as you talked about. So offline, I'll ask you for some reports or references that you find are most valuable in informing us of today's trends, and then perhaps we can share them with our audience as well. That'd be
Absolutely.
a great contribution. Let's come back to covering religion, title of your class at Columbia. Given these significant divides and recognizing that religion is not the only factor, may not be in fact the factor, as you've said, it's maybe more about land and power, etc. And yet ultimately they get to be characterized at times in faith terms as well, these divisions. How did Ari and you manage to find common ground, knowing that, like, knowing as I do from the time that I've spent briefly with him and more substantively, with you, that he comes from a very different perspective and lived experience.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. I wish he were here with us right now to have this conversation, share his
Right.
perspective. Very briefly, I'll say there's a couple principles that I think we apply. One, we knew each other for years before October 7th and worked together, but we came together not to have difficult conversations together. We came together to train better journalists. And so that's a shared purpose that we've
Right.
had.
And by the way, just
Yeah.
for our friends, Greg, who are listening in, let's just kind of highlight the contrast, right? So here is Ari. Can you describe his profile, for our friends?
Sure. Ari's former New York Times religion reporter for, I think, 20 some odd years. He's observant Jewish. He defines himself as a Zionist, meaning that he supports the idea of a Jewish state in Israel. I'm Palestinian, as you know from this conversation in the background, and I am not a nationalist. And I'm not a Zionist. I believe in equality, fundamental human rights for everyone, Jews, is Palestinians, Muslims, Christians, Israelis, and I don't think there's a good future for any Israeli or Palestinian without a sound reality for everyone there. And in its assumption, Zionism, this idea of a Jewish safe haven in Israel, the birthplace of in Palestine, rather, the birthplace of Judaism. I don't think anybody could argue with that historically. I think what Zionism became, and not theoretically, meant and means the disenfranchisement and oppression of millions of Palestinians. And I think that's wrong. And we can go into that history a little bit more. But I'm very clear about my positions, which do not align with Ari's at all. And we're not, teaching this class, we're not debating in front of our class, but we do have a shared purpose in the class. And that is we both recognize that media, and there's not the media, there's not one media, there are a variety of different media outlets, needs to do a better job of reporting in general. And we have a framework called empathetic objectivity that we employ. We want our journalists to be able, when they write and say, if I were interviewing you, Hitendra, and I really disagreed with your perspective and my article disagreed with your perspective, I would want you to read my article or see my piece. And despite my point of view, say, hey, wait a second, you got that just right. That's exactly me. You got me better than I get myself. So we want to make sure as a first step, it's not the last step, and particularly if you were trying to manipulate the facts or whatever, but as a first step of journalism to make sure that the communities we're talking about, which are not our own, feel that their positions are fairly represented. Otherwise, media and journalism is not a conversation in the public square about difficult and fraught topics, which it needs to be if we're going to effectively address them.
In recent times, really, isn't it the case that I'm noticing a fair amount of polarization in the media itself, right? It's reflecting what is happening in the social fabric, as in, journalists are taking more and more fairly clear positions, on issues and writing through a certain lens of almost activism rather than, objective, multifaceted, nuanced reporting. That's what I'm sensing and seeing. And I think the public is also generally starting to recognize that certain media can be labeled, essentially more pro something and anti something and what have you. Is that sort of what, you're all concerned about?
Absolutely.
Journalism?
Well, yes, and I mean, objectivity. How can you be objective in media? What does that mean? That's a big question, particularly with the rise of social media. And did we ever have objective media? I think many people would say no. It's always been biased to some extent. People often ask, "What's one news source I can read on Israel Palestine to get the truth?" And the reality is that, I think there's some that are better than others that I would recommend you to. Spoiler alert: none of them based in the United States. But what I would say on any issue now is that, like, media, mainstream media, so-called mainstream media that has a lot of financing, has specific points of view. And I think it's important for consumers to be aware of that. And I think it's frustrating for many consumers when we want to learn about our world. We recognize the importance of journalism, and everything feels like it's a manipulation. in some sense of what facts are chosen, how facts are presented, who's interviewed, how perspectives are presented. We think that the intervention of our class extends far beyond covering religion. The principles that we use, the frameworks that we use, extend throughout, potential media. If you get to that baseline where, for example, if you come from a conservative, Christian, evangelical, Republican community in Arkansas, like my co-founder at Telos, the organization I also run, like if you read an article that a liberal Palestinian American from California who lives in New York and wrote, like, you would want to see that this is a fair representation of my worldview. And that's an important baseline, because otherwise we're not having a real conversation. We are manipulating like people as pawns in this story that we want to tell about the world and about our role in it.
Let's really build on that a little bit and test this out with you. So I'm noticing that my feeling is that when you have a certain avowed view, on some divisive topic, and you believe that a way to kind of help the world get to move towards that view and taking action on it is to suppress certain facts and only promote facts that you believe would be in favor of your position. My feeling is that, in fact, you are likely doing a disservice to your position, because you will end up very quickly disengaging certain audiences who can see through, your agenda. And therefore, those who are supporting you will always support you. But those who are on the margin, if they have a discriminating mind, they will see through what you're trying to do, and you will not have a chance to win them over truly in their hearts and minds, because they will realize that you're coming here with an agenda. Whereas if you were objective, and from a place of objectivity, including looking at the counterfactuals to kind of your piece, you had to ultimately do the harder work of building your thesis on the basis of all of those comfortable and uncomfortable truths, then you're more likely to carry those people with you. So that is one argument in favor of sort of moving closer towards kind of what you're espousing in the class.
Right.
There's another one that I just want to kind of share with you that, was very, kind of, to me, thought-provoking. So after the recent, presidential election, there was, all kinds of postmortems being done on why the Democrats lost. There was a op-ed, I forget from whom, I think it was in the New York Times, who was arguing that the manner in which the mainstream media ended up actively supporting Kamala Harris in almost that kind of very polarized way ended up actually doing a disservice to her cause, because it ended up creating this kind of echo chamber where there was not as much of a grounding in the reality or what was truly happening on the ground. And so a lot of the, policymakers, decision makers in her, campaign were actually blindsided by, that set of affirmations and reaffirmations that were going on in the media about how amazing that campaign was, as opposed to the troubling realities of the, emotional shifts that, the American people had been making, those who shifted from the Biden vote to the Trump vote. So anyway, so those are at least two very objective arguments that you are shooting yourself in your own foot by not advancing your cause when you're not being objective. I don't know. I mean, what is the argumentation you give in that class as to why this is an important thing for journalists to take on, even when they feel deeply and emotionally about a certain cause?
Well, I think they're not journalists if they can't do this. A journalist, there's a little maxim that says, like, if you're talking to two people and one interviewer says it's raining outside, the other says it's sunny, you want to show their perspectives, but your job as a journalist is there's an objective fact there. Is it raining or is it sunny? You can't just be, well, they present these two different perspectives. So you've got to be skilled in both. You've got to be able to work with both narrative and fact. And that's a journalist's role. I think, a couple quick things. One, I'm so in alignment with the core argument that if your objective is to actually convince other people of your position, why hide anything? Like if my position is thought out, one, I should be able to defend it in the public square. And two, if the public square is important for the advancement of our collective social good, we need to be able to welcome many perspectives, even those we find injurious and harmful, into the public square, which is something that we just don't really do well at the current moment. The counter argument to that, though, is that like we may no longer have a shared purpose here, right? Because part of the manipulation of fact and argument is to build your tribe, it's to build your team. That's a power game. When we've lost sort of this commitment, this deep commitment to the practice of democracy, which says that there's more to my story. Even though Ari and I, for example, are very rooted in our positions, which some would say are oppositional, and I hope Ari is going to change his position, and I think he's objectively wrong, and I think that his position has visited untold horror upon my family, and ultimately on all Israelis and Palestinians. I understand it comes from a very deep and good, well-meaning place. It's very much rooted in his worldview, but I also know that my position is as deeply convicted in it. It's not the only perspective, right? And so I think what we're losing right now is this commitment to say that as deeply convicted as I am in my worldview, there's a story that's larger than all of us. There's a common good. There's that my well-being does not have to come at the expense of your well-being. And the only way that we can develop that and find that space where we both can flourish, where we can know dignity, freedom, agency to do whatever ever we want is together, not in our respective silos. And in America right now, it's like we don't share the same realities. We don't even share the same facts anymore. And so our class is not a silver bullet to this at all. I don't think there is anything. But what I will say, and why I've been willing to go to places that some from my community and my communities are quite critical of, is that if we can't do this on our campuses, if we can't model and learn how to have a public square on our campus, if we can't orient ourselves to the true goal of democracy, which is maximum human flourishing, even for those that we really deeply disagree with, like, it's no wonder that our institutions outside of our campuses are failing. We have to be able to do this on our university campuses, and we have to learn how to do this in our personal lives, in our business relationships. And if we do that, my contention and belief, despite all the evidence to the contrary in today's world, is that there is more happiness, more wealth, not that these things are sort of but there's a better reality for all of us, for us today and for future generations. This is the path towards true safety, not simply vanquishing our opponent, who will never go away, but who will reform in in different in a different expression at some point. So I think what you're getting at is deeply true, but I think what it also hints at this other sort of negative zeitgeist of the moment, which is that we've lost this sense of shared purpose. And without that, I think we're in a very dangerous place.
So how do you create this kind of a melting of the hearts, this kind of a transformation of the mind, in young, journalists, or aspiring journalists. So in this class, I recall you mentioning that before the recent painful conflagration that has happened in the Middle East, you've been taking students there and you've been having them expose themselves and experience certain things that otherwise would be purely conceptual, to be had a conversation about in the classroom. Could you share a little bit about that sort of experiential element and the kind of, perhaps, I don't know, perceptions and hardships that it kind of engenders?
Absolutely. One of the techniques that really works is immersive experience, shared experience. And there's so much data around this. You mentioned also that I run this nonprofit, which I founded after leaving the negotiations in 2009. That nonprofit, the intuition around sort of like peacemaking or building social movements to maximize common good, it came from the realization that when people came on the ground in Israel, Palestine, and saw the reality for themselves, not just the reality of Palestinians, but of Israelis, they were transformed. They saw things differently. They saw their relationship to the place differently. It was easy before to put people in boxes, but once you have personal relationships and personal experience, often experiences that don't reconcile with one another, it becomes a completely different conversation. It's not algebra in your head. It's not, okay, this is the correct answer. That's, these people are evil. These people are good. End of story. And so, what we set out to do in Telos, for example, we work on a variety of seemingly intractable issues now, but our first and primary issue was America's relationship to Israel-Palestine. We had a point of view that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this a situation that many people call apartheid, whatever you want to call it, that it persisted so long, almost a century, in part because of American foreign policy. And unlike other foreign policy issues in America, say North Korea's nuclear weapons, this is an issue that it functioned much more like a domestic issue, like, healthcare or guns or immigration reform, something like that, meaning that everyday Americans really cared about it and organized around it. And so constituency mattered. And so the idea was like, we were in this space then and now that you're either pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, not a space focusing on the reality, which that, no Palestinians or Israelis will know security, freedom, dignity, equality, equity long-term, unless everyone does. There has to be this centering of human rights before and beyond any conversation of politics. And if you can just write one group of people off as not human and not deserving of equal rights, it's just going to be a perpetuation of a system, of a violent system, which produces violence. And so what we wanted to do to break this binary is to allow American leaders and their communities from target communities to see that the reality in its full complexity, to break them out of their own sets of stereotypes. And we used immersive experience as a tool, which has been highly effective on a limited test case. We haven't done this, unfortunately, to scale yet. But similarly, at Columbia, this is one of the reasons why Ari and I connected, is when he founded this covering religion course more than 20 years ago, he said, hey, we got to get journalists in the field. This reporting cannot be abstract. We've got to get them out of their comfort zones. They have to experience something. They have to feel something. Your feelings are not things to be afraid of. They're data points in the journey of how you manage and how you understand the world and your relationship to it, whether as a professional or just as a human being. And so we have students from all over the world in each of our classes. So they come with a variety of different perspectives. Last year and this year, we've been going to Ireland, Northern Ireland. We travel to other parts of the world as well. But it's this immersive experience that gets people out of their shoes. Because once you're confronted with a reality, positive or negative, that you don't fully understand, wow, it can be life-changing. And then when you do that with a cohort of your peers who bring all their different perspectives and you see how they're wrestling with it and you wrestle together, then you get to that place of shared reality. You have a shared set of facts. That facts is the immersive experience that you shared that you have to be accountable to. And you're having a conversation that's based on a shared set of facts rather than sort of these abstract caricatures of what I think or what I feel. It's what did we experience together and how do we negotiate that? So the shared experience model is something that takes a lot of investment, people say, but it's the thing that works. It's a thing that absolutely works for people to have real conversations about things that matter. It gets us out of our sort of space of certainty and into a space of curiosity, which is exactly what you want and need in the public square.
Wonderful, wonderful. I want to test with you a thought about what may be going on in those situations. I'm only able to hypothesize, but tell me if you agree or not. You talked about how what it does is creates this enriched library of shared facts, of a kind that you would never have perhaps opened your hearts and minds to if you hadn't actually gone and immersed yourself in those communities. And then those facts invoke certain feelings, in you. The thought I want to test with you is that there are some significant inner shifts that are happening in the context of these experiences. And that one way through which to at least keep the hope alive and advance that hope of a ultimately just and lasting peace, even from the place of divisions that we have in certain parts of our society and world today, is if we can first help create those inner shifts. And an inner shift would be that while I may stand significantly opposed to you in my position on certain things in terms of what the material outcomes are that I'm striving for, or you striving for my community, your community, I can at least start from a place of deep respect for your community, for a sense of almost like love and connection and a hope for, the collective success and joy that I would want for your community just as much as for mine. Right. And if those feelings from inside and those, in some ways, those intentions from inside can be purified, into something that is more integrative and collective, then we may still continue to disagree as to who's right, who's wrong, what's the, most important value today, and, what the path may be or not to any kind of fair divisions of the material bounties of nature, and land and all that. But at least we are starting from a place of deep caring, connection, and respect.
Well, I mean, I love that term inner shift. I think that's so key. I think, in our broader culture, we see activism or engagement often in two poles. One is sort of, this outer, what you do on the world. You're out there and you're protesting, you're advocating, in the United States, for example, in the halls of Congress. And that's one important aspect of the work of activism in the world. Congress determines how we spend a multi-trillion-dollar budget and where we, send weapons and what we manage, all of these things that affect our shared reality and are done with our shared resources. But I think this work is also deeply internal. And so there's sort of the ascetic model in which, the other pole is it's only internal, right? That you just kind of retreat from the world. And this is often, expression of some ascetic forms of religion in which you just do this inner work. And by healing and purifying internally, this has an external work. It has an external effect. I would say both are true at the same time. It's this inner shift is necessary for a healthy outer shift. And this connects again to this core idea that I keep coming back to is purpose. Like, why are we doing this? I think, something that we talk a lot about at Telos, and a concept which can sound a little loosey-goosey to some, is mutual flourishing. This idea that our well-beings are intertwined. And I absolutely believe that from a biological and scientific perspective to a sociological perspective. And so what that means is that we need to actually recognize that building a world in which everyone has maximum agency is all of our responsibility. And responsibility is not just outer, it's also inner. Now that sounds really abstract. I want to give sort of an example that your listeners may be familiar with, but sort of a meta example, and that is evolution of LGBTQ rights in America. And now, obviously, this is a fraught issue in the moment, particularly with respects to trans rights. But same-sex marriage, for example, is broadly accepted among most Americans, even religious Americans who do not believe, based on their religious convictions, that same-sex marriage should be recognized, at least within their churches or houses of worship. And the reason for that shift comes back to the reality that over a period of decades, there was a lot of work by LGBTQ Americans to quote unquote come out. It made an issue personal. These were now people's sons, daughters, sisters, sometimes spouses. There was this awakening, if you will, to a reality in which people had to be confronted with like, okay, well, maybe this is my daughter, and maybe I hold these things to be true, but I love my daughter. And there's something more here that's more important to me than sort of a literal interpretation of the scripture, even if I might actually still believe it's true. I want to have a relationship with this person. I want them to be happy. I want to show them love. I want them to show me love. And I don't want to deny them an ability to love in a way that maybe I don't want to love and that I don't fully understand. And so there were a number of inner shifts that sort of like collected over a period of decades and have resulted in a reality in which people are holding a number of things that don't actually reconcile in tension. So many people were saying, well, yeah, no, I don't necessarily believe in gay marriage, same-sex marriage. I don't think the Bible condones this. I'm not sure this is a real marriage in a biblical sense. I'm not sure what happens to these people after we die. And at the same time, well, I love this person deeply, I think they deserve the same, to be able to make the same choices. And maybe God has a bigger plan than I can understand from my limited understanding or reading of my scripture. And what was critical there was a number of inner shifts on a massive scale, on a sociological scale. So it wasn't just my story, it wasn't just your story. I think this is an important example to bring out, because you can't have the outer shift without the inner shift. The inner shift is what drives the outer shift. But if you don't take action afterwards, if people don't speak up, if they don't say, hey, wait a second, I may not be for this, or actually now I am for this because I see things differently. If people don't, if they stay silent, if there is no outer shift, nothing changes in the world. You need both.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Sometimes I see the arc of, recent human history. By recent, I mean, I don't know, like the last 1,000 odd years. Can't really feel I know a whole lot about sort of what happened in the several thousands of years before that. But in more, recent times, perhaps in the AD as opposed to the BC, what I find is that there is actually some affirming evidence that human capacity to empathize, with their fellow humans has been growing. First within perhaps just your own gender, or within perhaps just your own race or your own religion, and then beyond your household, and then going from there into a larger frame and a larger frame. I think what you're talking about here is that through some of these more recent evolutions in our social way of life and everything, that naturally so via exposure and via observing and experiencing certain kind of challenges, issues, dynamics within the more increasingly diverse milieu of our own family and social circle, gradually and naturally, this human evoking of empathy and compassion is starting to arise at a more expansive level across groups and across these intersections. And that gives a lot of hope, isn't it? To where humanity is headed. Despite some of the dark clouds that we experience in the world today, that just more exposure, more commingling, etc., will just lead to more expansion of the heart.
I mean, I think that's true. And I also honestly question that right now. I think there are, a couple sort of counter arguments to that. I mentioned earlier, and I know it's controversial for some of your listeners, but this is my perspective, and it's shared by almost, every human rights advocate around the world, that there's an ongoing genocide, which we're seeing live streamed happening in Gaza right now. And people all the empathy in the world hasn't been able to stop any of those bombs. There's a power dynamic here at play, and maybe one day and for future generations, but it feels, for people of my generation who grew up thinking that the atrocities that we learned about in World War II were historic and would never be repeated. And, there's been so many genocides since, and this one, happening now. And it's this sense of helplessness and the rise of technology, which seems to sort of like atomize us in particular ways. And there are all of these fears. And so I think there's one perspective that would say that, well, maybe perhaps empathy is effective for evolution for only for those who we consider human. And yet there's a whole segment and set of society that we still, for whatever reason, do not deem as worthy of human rights, whether in Gaza, horrifically for 2 millennia, often Jewish people, people in the global South, whatnot, and so there's this perspective there. I think there's another perspective which is less dark, but I think is important to sort of bring to the table. And this is one view of history which some historians have proposed over the decades, but this idea of the pendulum swinging, and we see the world move from one extreme to the other, almost predictably when you take a step back and you see these larger patterns. And what we may be in right now is this retrenchment. Whatever the case, I think I'm particularly concerned in this moment because in the United States, for example, we've never been a perfect country, and we have so many flaws, which we can spend another podcast talking about. But it felt at a time, at least, there was an aspiration to want to have this thing called America, in which we, the people, all the people, know more freedom. And now it feels so divided that we're living in different realities, and if you're on that side of the divide, you're not even American, much less, you're not even human, much less American, right? And so the level of polarization is, I think polarization is a symptom, not the problem. It's like we've lost this shared purpose. And I think on a global scale, and this is something as a former human rights lawyer I care deeply about. I'm not going to get too political, but the Biden administration, and I am a registered Democrat, whatever, has kind of like talked about Ukraine and the world and China in terms of like international human rights and preserving the the rules-based order and whatnot. And yet we've lost this aspiration to human rights, and we're dismantling all of these post-World War II institutions, which were deeply flawed. I can tell you how flawed they are from years of personal experience, but at least there was this idea that there needed to be a foundation in the world. And that foundation needed to recognize that every human life has value. And so we had to build a world system, this institutionalized interdependence, that we'd agree there's a baseline that we would never, at least aspirationally, depart from. And we're losing that aspiration. And now, these things such as like peacemaking and diplomacy and human rights, they feel like cruel jokes to much of the world's population. And that's really scary for me, because if we're going into a dark time and we need to swing back to something sort of more expansive, we have to find a way to recognize that our best future, our best individual futures, particularly for the younger generations and future generations, involve a good future for all. And as cliche as that sounds, I think ultimately it's true. But we seem to be moving so quickly away from that. And I don't know how empathy is going to get us back in this moment. Maybe it will. Maybe these are seeds we're planting for future years, but I think things are going to get a lot more difficult before they get better.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for being so heartfelt and so open about all your sentiments and your concerns and your positions on some of these very divided matters of today. I do want to take a moment here to just pause and honor the sentiments you've expressed about the pain and suffering that has been unleashed in the Middle East. You have highlighted the killings in the Palestinian regions. I know that in your own reflections, you have shared how much pain you feel for the terrible acts of terrorism, on October 7th, in Israel as well. So I know, you have a uniquely, just open-hearted capacity to be able to appreciate and tune in to pain and suffering, in every part, of the social fabric, including those that may otherwise be taking military and other positions that you are fiercely opposed to, which is unique and special. There is clearly no immediate path to an answer in how to diminish the level of violence and aggression in those communities, as we see, at least in the public discourse that is happening, today. Therefore, I want to ask you what you see as your purpose in helping to create more of the conditions for peace at a time when it does look very seemingly impossible in that part of the world in particular that you have such deep personal ties with. Before we get there, though, I want to offer a ray of light, right, as a possibility. I mean, you were doing that earlier when you were talking about the history of America's openness and acceptance ultimately, and embrace of gay marriage and rights. But there was a very interesting statistic, Greg, that I recently came across, and it has to do with Americans' views of how divided we are on our most important values. I don't know if you come across this, but what this is shared is that if you look at the last about 30 years, there is a significant groundswell of people who believe that we are deeply divided in terms of our most important values. And that number has gone from 60% feeling that way to now 80% feeling that way. 60 was high enough, and now it's 80% over the last 30 years. And yet there is, in fact, a blip in that 30-year history. There was 1 year in which it just radically, just shifted. And in that year, around 75% of people felt that we were actually mostly united in terms of our most important values, as opposed to divided. Can you, I don't know if you've come across that statistic, but if you haven't, can you guess what that year might be in the last 30 years?
In the last 30 years. Okay. I would guess I have not come across that statistic, so I'm really fascinated. And two dates come to mind, which one may seem counterintuitive, but 2001, and then 2020.
I see. Yeah. And you got the first one right. It is 2001. And I mean, you look at 2020, for example, and sometimes people bring up, the year that Obama was elected or something. You still find there was lots of divisions, and we had a certain groundswell of people voting for or against having certain position, but there's a large number of people on the other side. But as you said, 2001, the Twin Tower kind of experience was a moment where 75% of Americans just completely switched their thinking. And the reason I want to share that is because I was here in New York, around that time. There was this incredible sense of unity, first within New York, and then for America and for New York, for from different parts of the world, and Americans with each other. And those men and women, in blue, who were like from the fire department and the police, who were walking up, the Twin Towers to save lives while people were rushing out, knowing that they were putting their own life, at great peril and ultimately perished there, was just a perfect example of like humanity rising to a place where, I'm comfortable sacrificing my own self-interest. I'm comfortable doing for everyone, regardless of color of skin and race and gender and, religion and all of that. I mean, there was just something incredible, unifying that was happening there. So since that shift happened, not as an incremental shift, that the number went from 60 to 55 to 45 to 10 who think that we are mostly divided. But it happened almost immediately. I just want to throw that out because I wonder is, what is that magic wand that we can wave, partly based on the conditions that we are thrust into, but partly based on the capacities that you see somebody like a Mother Teresa illuminate for us, or a Gandhi illuminate for us, or a Mandela illuminate for us, who were able to somehow, in extremely divided times, get people behind a certain sacrificing, selfless work, commitment kind of cause, that they were pursuing. So anyway, your thoughts on when you're seeing what's happening in Israel Palestine, is there any possibility that rising from the ashes of the pain of destruction of what has happened so far can be a movement of peace?
I mean, I have to be honest that I don't know. And right now I feel particularly adrift. I feel like a lot of my work has been a failure in the sense that we haven't been able to stop what we're seeing today. And it's been predicted. I worked on, for example, Gaza disengagement when Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip in 2005. And everything that you're seeing today was predicted for many years. I spent years of my life, actually, 2005 to 2008, predicting the exact scenario that you see today. And so it's not a surprise. There's no, the real intelligent failure is, why do we know bad things are going to happen? And the world is set up to you can't rule over millions of people indefinitely, and doesn't excuse what happened on October 7th and some of the horrors that we saw there. But nothing excuses what happened to Palestinians every day before for decades, or every day since, right? War crimes don't justify war crimes. And so I receive your question in a moment where I have to be really honest that I feel particularly bereft of hope as an adjective. There's a wonderful Palestinian theologian actually named Mitri Raheb, and he says that, remember, hope is what you do. It's not an adjective, it's a verb. And right. So right now, when I look out in the world, I don't see the rays of light that I did at other points in my life. I have to be honest that I feel particularly uncertain, but I have to remember that there are patterns. Just as when you plant seeds in soil, things grow. And hope is not about what I feel, it's about what I do. And so that's the real ray of light. I think, responding to you specifically, I have to say intellectually, not emotionally, where I land is that we do have quite a bit of untapped agency. all of you and I and everyone listening to this podcast right here. And the examples that you cite actually, I think, highlight that in a non-direct fashion. So what happened after September 11th or October 7th in Israel is there was a lot of unity where there was deep division for this moment. Unfortunately, I think many parties saw this as a resource to be exploited. And this is what happened post 9/11 with US foreign policy. We went and invaded Iraq and completely destabilized the Middle East, seeing,
Yeah.
again, a terrible chapter in the Middle East, setting up what you see today more than two decades later, which, Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11,
Yeah.
as we know, and Saddam Hussein and whatnot. And so, not to run down the foreign.
By the way, I'm sorry, just to pause and just build on that point. I think like the message I take from you citing that implication of that sense of shared unity and mission that happened after 9/11 is that sometimes it is good to be divided rather than be united. I remember when the Iraq war was starting, and I was seeing even the New York Times, this most liberal newspaper, even from that time, starting to talk about the American military there as heroes going in there to kind of save the world and all of that. And I was like, but wait a second, like, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? And why is the American media not being a little bit more just quizzical and questioning and skeptical about, the president's decision here? And it just wasn't there for a while. You might remember in Congress, they had changed, French fries to freedom fries because France was questioning, whether the war should happen at all or not. And so I think the implication there is that sometimes it's actually useful to actually have divisions in society where people are not lining up behind, ignoble causes.
Yeah, and also that unity can be used as a force, as a destructive force. I mean, it's not just that we were unified, but any dissent was considered un-American. I mean, after October 7th, I was writing and doing things October 8th, and war crimes do not justify war crimes. That was really controversial, saying exactly where this was headed. I told you I spent 3 years of my life, 2005 to 2008, talking about Gaza 2020. This scenario. The United Nations wrote a report in 2012, which you can Google, called Gaza 2020, predicting this scenario if Israel continued to restrict the movement and freedom of millions of people. It wasn't that there was an easy way out, but it was headed to a very, very, very dark place. You can't rule over millions of people indefinitely and expect a good result. That's violence, structural violence in and of itself. And so, after October 7th, anybody who was like, well, Israel has a right to self-defense. Of course, Israel has a right to self-defense. Every country has a right to self-defense. Palestinians, as an occupied people, have a right to self-defense. These are sacred rights. It's not a question of whether we have these rights. It's how we use them. Like, is for targeting civilians ever justified? No, it's absolutely not. That's prohibited, absolutely, under international law. And I would say, from moral analysis as well, whether it's a non-state actor or a state actor. And so what I wanted to bring back a very nuanced point here that about agency, because I think, we're recording this now a week after the infamous assassination of the CEO of United Healthcare, right? And that's part of the story is the outpouring of sort of indifference or even support for the murder here. And I think this highlights a couple things, both of why I feel like I'm such a failure right now, but also sort of like where the agency lies is because if we knew what was going to happen in Gaza, if we knew, for example, like 9/11, absolutely horrific moment in our nation's history. Of course, we have to react to this moment. Like there's nothing that justifies 9/11. And the US was, there were these rumblings for many decades, given our military presence in the Middle East and how we were exerting that in the Middle East. I'm not trying to make a clear analogy between all of these things, but the healthcare system, every American I know with good health insurance, like we may like our health insurance because we've got better than the alternatives, but we hate the health insurance industry. Does that mean I believe that murder is the way out? No. But what it gets to is the fact that a lot of what we see happen, these ruptures, these violent, massive ruptures, are not just predicted, they are predictable. And for whatever reason, we only
Right.
choose to pay attention in moments of extreme violence. And I think that comes back to us. It comes back to us and our responsibility. It comes back to how we organize and when we mobilize. If we only, if we only do something after the bomb goes off, well, wow, like, the institutions we've built, if we only hold genocide, if we only condemn genocide after it's over, like, what are we what are the institutions that we're building, and how are we going to build a more just and more free and more prosperous society for all? So it comes
Yeah.
back to the set of questions that we don't have answers to, but that we have to figure out. How do we build systems and behaviors and cultures that can anticipate these ruptures before they happen? And really deal with sort of these deeper questions, the deeper violence, the structural violence around us that eventually, like a tectonic plate, will rupture at some point. Right now, I have to be honest, I'm a little concerned because like now it seems like, well, the only time people pay attention to Palestinians, and now they do. This is the first time in my life where people around the world, in large measure are like, wow, we're listening to the Palestinian story. They may not get it right, but a lot of people care. We have to be honest, it was a result of October 7th, this horrific terrorist attack. Now there might be a conversation about healthcare uh, or not, but there'll probably be a rise in vigilantism around the United States after this assassination and through this rising inequality. I think this, the obstacle that we may be facing is the fact that we live in an increasingly undemocratic society. It's more an oligarchy with democratic practices. And so, we've got to be creative in how we come together and build more resilient institutions that can promote, individual responsibility, individual agency alongside collective well-being. These things should not be opposed. These things actually feed each other.
Yeah, yeah. Powerful. No, thank you. And thank you for bringing into focus as well the terrible shake up and wake up call that America's received from the killing of the United Healthcare CEO. I was thinking a little bit about sort of that moment as well, and reflecting on sort of what's the message, to take from that with regard to, what is structurally ailing and, in our world, and the narrow lens through which to view it, through the reactions of some of the, social media kind of posts around this, is that, our insurance, industry and healthcare is all messed up. And that's one way to look at it. I've also thought about how, well, healthcare more broadly, sometimes even the practices of physicians, has lacked at times a certain empathy, humanity, certain, deep sense of care, a certain perhaps obsession with, the next surgery, that they should perform versus, taking perhaps, more preventative approach or something like that. Sometimes the healthcare systems, themselves, have also been at times, overbilling or underserving or, what have you. And so it's not just one player within the healthcare ecosystem,
Yeah.
but it's really quite a intricate sort of morass of like factors and incentive systems and material sort of rewards people get for doing the wrong behavior rather than the right behavior. And then I started to think about, but what about us too, the common public, and what are some practices we put into play there? About, for example, I noticed that in America that we have a obsession with wanting to preserve life, beyond a point where it is actually natural at times. And so the percentage of cost, for an elderly care that goes into just the last like X months, 6 months or 3 months of somebody's life, just because you just want to keep them alive, and nature doesn't work like that. Nature works on a cycle of birth, preservation, and then ultimately death, an honoring of like that, chapter coming to a close and ushering, that spirit of that person to whatever it is that, might lie in the afterlife. I mean, if only we were more open to that, we might perhaps take a different approach and not put so much pressures and expectations on our healthcare systems in certain situations and moments like that. How much responsibility are we taking over the health and care of our own bodies? I notice in sports, for example, sometimes the people are pushing themselves to the limits and then getting all kinds of injuries that they could have been a little bit more thoughtful about if they'd been careful. And then they wouldn't have to take pain medications, and then they wouldn't get addicted to pain medications and things like that. That just causes all kinds of vicious cycles. And of course, a diet and a lifestyle. America is, having increasing epidemic rates of obesity that, in part, have to be somewhat a sense of personal agency that we can feel over them. It can't be just DNA, for everyone in all situations. And so suddenly you realize the cost of healthcare that is ballooning. And then, of course, we are the investors. In the retail world, it is people like us who are actually putting our savings and wanting, stocks to actually appreciate the stock price and every quarter give us some kind of tangible instant gratification about how our wealth has increased. And those are the very companies that are then incentivized to go out and, reject claims and all that because they want to kind of boost their bottom line, if that's the case, with insurance companies. So suddenly you realize that, my God, like I'm a player in this too. Everyone is a player in this. And so I just wonder, like, how you think, when you think about, for example, even Israel Palestine and all that. I mean, this notion that I found very, very core to the Mother Teresa and the Gandhi sort of approach to change making, which is to be the change and to really recognize that it's not just something I'm seeking from the outside, but it's also a kind of growth that I need to nurture on the inside. What do you think of that? Like, is that going to need to be critical as part of the growing awareness and realization in the world, or are there certain causes and situations that are clearly more extrinsic than intrinsic?
No, I think it's a both and I think that perspective is absolutely foundational. At TELUS, we developed a tool called the Principles and Practices of Peacemaking, and it's got 6 principles, like things that you need to focus on if you really want to work towards a goal of mutual flourishing: maximum agency, health, safety, dignity for as many people as possible. And it has 6 practices. Like, how do you do that? And it's not a perfect tool; it's a tool in evolution. But we drew on a lot of our experience in the field, and then folks like Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., and also just local activists throughout history and contemporaneously. And there are a couple principles there that are actually practices in our remaining time I want to pull out that I think are helpful.
Wonderful. Let's do that.
Great. So there are 2 I want to mention in response to this, and actually bring it back to healthcare as opposed to Israel Palestine, because I'm an expert on Israel Palestine. I'm not on healthcare. I'm just like everybody on this call. I'm a consumer. I'm an investor through my my portfolios, whatnot, and deeply concerned as a human being. But there's 2 practices I think that get to this point. The first is the second practice, which is to hold competing perspectives in tension. The idea that multiple things may be true at the same time. And I know you like data a lot. There's a great quote from Niels Bohr, the pioneer of quantum physics, about this. And this was about the physical world, the subatomic world, not sort of the social world. He said, the opposite of truth is fact, but is falsehood. But the opposite of fact is falsehood. But the opposite of truth may very well be another profound truth. And so recognizing that when we're building this world that we live in, and we're just these small points who have positionality, that guess what? Like when I'm talking to you, Hitendra, you may be saying something that is actually opposed to what I'm saying in a sense, but it may also be true. And there's a great old story about this to illustrate this. I want to share 2 more illustrations. One is the story. Have you heard about the blind men and the elephants?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the way I have, but for our audience, please share the story.
Very quick, just group of blind men walking through the forest, as they do, stumble along an elephant. One grabs a trunk, one grabs a tusk, one grabs a tail, one grabs a foot, and they're trying to figure out what this is, describing it to each other, and they start getting into a fight about it. The reality is there's an objective truth. There's an actual elephant, and they're all touching it, but they're truthfully describing different aspects of this larger truth. So again, it gets us this idea of the necessity, when we're living in a reality that's much larger than ourselves, to hold truths that are larger than ourselves and recognize that not one of us owns the truth. And this is particularly important in diplomacy and business, just in our personal lives, because I think what we tend to do is when we hear something that goes counter to what we know or believe to be true, we take it as an indictment of us or our beliefs. And it may not be. It may be somebody who's just sharing a completely different experience that is just as valid as ours from a different position.
Yeah, I remember in the legal world, there sometimes is like that oath that you take that I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And when I look at it that way, then I feel it really is a simple way to kind of articulate the quest that you were just talking about, the Niels Bohr gave us, or that story of the blind man and the elephant, which is that I may claim that I'm telling the truth, But are there other aspects of the truth that I'm not seeing and acknowledging? And until I get them as well, I at least don't have the whole truth. I just have part of the truth.
Right.
And then maybe what I'm claiming, some parts of it are true, but then some parts of it may not be. So nothing but the truth as well. Right? Anyway, so
Right.
I'm just gonna, yeah.
Or maybe what I'm claiming may be completely true, at the same time as what you're claiming to be true. And just because you have another vantage point or truth doesn't invalidate me. It's not about me. It's about
Right.
something larger than both of us. And so I think it's important for us to constantly keep that in mind, that there is a larger truth that none of us can claim full ownership over. And we can only access it when you've got a perspective on the tail and I've got a perspective on the trunk. The only way we can access that larger shared reality is through sharing of our truths, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, which may also be true alongside yours. And so when you're asking about this larger truth, all these things may be true at the same time. That, like, one, the healthcare industry is broken. Two, perhaps we have a fetishization with preserving life. I know from personal experience, my mom had a horrible, and I shepherded my mom in the U.S. and then my dad died in Ireland, where my brother lives, and it was a completely different experience. And that's a whole other podcast. But one of the things I recognized then, particularly with my mom, this was back in 2014, and many of my friends my age, their parents are still living, so I went through these end of life processes. Is how reluctant we are to have a conversation about what I'd say is a new stage of life, which is twilight. And the fact that most deaths are at a time of our choosing, and nobody wants to talk about it. And so it may also be true that we're investing incredible resources into prolonging life and quality of life, which is not healthy, and that our system is completely broken and it's not optimizing health. Where the United States has the lowest life expectancy of any developed nation, yet we have the highest per capita spending on healthcare resources, and what we're maximizing is profit, not human life. And so all the conversations around empathy and a much needed conversation about end of life care and what we do, which I wish I had when I was younger, before being confronted with it, and divided within our own family about how we manage these things. Like, all of those things need to happen at the same time, and they can be true at the same time. And our healthcare industry is like great at maintaining profits, and it's not necessarily the CEO's fault, even though this is the business that he went into. It's not his, he doesn't deserve to be murdered, obviously, but like that we're investing, and that we have in retirement portfolios that are invested in these companies, and we want to return on all of it. So there's a systemic issue that we need to address, as well as sort of the empathy gap and understanding our own mortality and reality and our own complicity in this. The second principle I wanted to highlight is really important. Second practice, rather. It's the fifth practice out of the principles and practices of peacemaking, and it's called self-interrogation. And what that means is, peacemaking is both internal and external. It's a holistic practice. But there's a couple of important things from self-interrogation. One is the greatest power, agency I have is within me and within the communities that I'm a part of. We are so easy to point the problem. Hey, Hitendra, it's you, it's your community, you're the problem. You need to change. Whereas in reality, that's the place where I have the least amount of agency and control. And in fact, when I understand what my complicity and my agency and whatever problem it is, whether it's Israel-Palestine, whether it's healthcare, whatever it is, when I assume responsibility over what I control, that's when I have the greatest power. And so it's this internal process, internal to me as a person, it's internal to me as a community, to start focusing on how can I write this. And the interesting thing with it, and you look at somebody like a Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr., when they start doing this internally in their community and they start living according to their principles, guess what? Other people start taking notice. Not to bring politics back into this, but I'll say as a New Yorker, I've been confounded for years. I don't understand this as sort of a quote unquote liberal New Yorker, that we live in the wealthiest city in the history of the world, and we have liberal leadership at every level of government. And, there are these progressive ideals about education and healthcare and how society, And yet, like, you walk into our subway, it's falling apart. Like, we've got terrible healthcare outcomes, terrible education outcomes, unless you're wealthy and you can pay for your kids to go to school. Like, we should we should be succeeding here. This shouldn't be about like us talking about Mississippi, a state that I know well through my domestic work, that's often 50th in these rankings, and blaming them for everything when we've got all the resources and supposedly the leaders. There's something that we've got to focus on internally. And I bet you, for those, who would, align at least sort of broadly with some liberal ideals, like I bet you that if we in our liberal communities or our conservative communities, if that's where you align, if we got really good at sort of delivering on what we say we believe in when we have the resources, a lot of people would take notice. So self-interrogation at a personal level, at a communal level, is one of the most important steps of peacemaking. It's why we put advocate as the last of the 12 steps. Like, the external work is like the other work really prepares you. It's the analysis. As the principles are analyzing what what you need to be focused on in order to work towards mutual flourishing. The practices are how you get there, and the last practice is advocate. And that's consistent, by the way, with all of the names that you cited, and we've been talking about sort of these storied saints or whatever. They did a lot of internal work within themselves and with their community before they went out into the world to do anything.
Yeah, beautiful. These practices and principles sound really well thought out, and what a powerful point you just made, that advocacy is the 12th, and the final one of these, and the self-interrogation piece also sounds, incredible and rich. So, what is that platform of Telos? I mean, who is the audience that you're serving and preparing and training for, bringing peace and change into the world? And if our audience was interested in wanting to tap into some of that wealth that you are creating there, is there any blog, newsletter, program that they can actually benefit from?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, we have some sort of specific target audiences related to the issues that we work on. So one is America's relationship to Israel-Palestine. Another is around sort of our deep divisions around our American story, and a program we call Restory, which is diving deep into the history and the realities of America. And we tend to focus on communities. Faith communities is a big focus, particularly Christians. We have some expertise with, and then also artists and storytellers. We think culture is very much upstream from politics, and if we can't tell stories that point us towards each other as opposed to away from each other, we're not creating this this culture of mutuality, which is needed to confront and deal with some of these seemingly intractable issues.
Yeah.
And we also do a lot of work with philanthropists and entrepreneurs as well, because capital is a key driver of
Yeah.
all of this. And I think people, want to be awakened to their worlds and their surroundings. We have a number of trainings that we do around the principles and practices of peacemaking that I'm sure colleagues could help with. We have that tool, which is publicly available. We have a number of FAQs. We have a blog and a newsletter, and we also have a podcast, which I'm currently on sabbatical, so I can't make a formal offer, but I'd love for you to join our podcast and to share your knowledge and cross-fertilize your knowledge with our community at some point.
Okay, well, that would be an honor, but that's amazing that you've actually got quite a cross section of different sort of groups out there that you're being able to support and serve. So kudos on that. And I want to sort of like end with two things. One is a little kind of offering for you in the context of what I've observed, what I've seen, and what you've shared. And the second is to invite you to actually have the last and final voice by reflecting on sort of where you are in your own growth journey, and what you're aspiring for in the next chapter that you want to do to continue to further expand your attunement with your soul, with your core, and the expression that you give it in the world. We have had such an impassioned and heartfelt conversation about the needs and affairs of the day, that and I know it comes from a place of deep care and selflessness from your side, but let us end on a more personal note and a personal reflection from you. So as you kind of like just consider and think about that as a closing reflection for us, let me just kind of share what I want to for you. And what's very evident to all our listeners and to me from the conversation we've had today is that you are just an incredibly heroic person. You have withstood, so much over the course of your life, and in what you have seen happen in the community that you are so deeply personally invested in. But then also have this expansiveness of heart, through which you can take the whole world into your embrace, not just this generation, but future generations. And that is incredible. It's on the one hand, I would call it rare, but on the other hand, I would call it like a reaffirmation of what any or all of us possess as potential at the very core of our being. And you express that, you tap into that, and you do it with so much articulation and so much care and so much nuance, and such depth of sensitivity towards wanting to make sure that you can honor and appreciate even those who take positions very contrarian to yours, to be able to bring them also into a shared frame and a shared quest. So again, I mean, I don't know, that was your mom that was responsible for this, or your dad, or your community, or just your own personal attunement to Jesus, knowing that you're, coming from the Christian world or beyond with God, or, wherever it is that you've tapped, all of this, kudos to them as well, for what it is that you're bringing out. And you did mention at one point, from a place of very sweet vulnerability, right? How much you're feeling like, wow, like, has my work just been a failure in the context of the travesties and tragedies of the time today? And that sparked this sort of reflection from me, which is what I want to share with you, which is Mother Teresa, after she got the Nobel Peace Prize, was in Rome, and there was a journalist who was wanting to challenge her a little bit. And, so he was saying, Mother Teresa, look, I mean, you've done this incredible work on the one hand, but on the other hand, there are millions of people right now starving and struggling, and so at the end of the day, like, how do you feel? Like, has it been a failure? The fact that, despite all these years you spent in that, like, there's just, that problem is not going away. And she looked at him, and she said, if I may, I've never tried and wanting to change the world. All I wanted to do was to be a pure drop of water in which God's light can shine. And she said, do you want to join me? If you could also be that pure drop of water, then there would be two of us. And she says, are you married? And he says, yes, mother. And she says, well, then, can you invite your wife also into this? And then there will be three pure drops of water. And she says, do you have children? And he says, yes, yes, mother, I have three children. And she says, well, why don't you invite them also on this? And then there will be six pure drops of water for us. And, it was such a beautiful lesson, that I took from experiencing and seeing that yes, I mean, these problems sometimes can look so larger than life and so beyond our reach, to have any material impact on. And yet we keep striving, we keep doing our part to be those pure drops of water. And that is who you are, and that is what you're doing. And so please keep that going, because that is beautiful. And today itself, I know you must impact so many who are not here with us in a physical presence and community, but who are definitely, I think, getting very deeply sparked, not just by the articulation of your message and your stories, but also just by your very core spirit that shines through so beautifully. So thank you, Greg, for all of that. And I turn it back to you for sharing more of a personal reflection. Yeah.
I receive that, and it's deeply moving and humbling. And Hitendra, and I welcome your open and particularly giving spirit. I know there's a lot that we don't agree on, even though we don't know each other very well yet. And yet I think this is kind of that spirit that we want to cultivate. And you're reminding me, I think, for me, part of the strength that keeps, I had some of the most amazing parents, but and I truly, I think they were saints. I'm not joking. And I'm not a particular faithful person. I don't I'm not great at sort of living up to my espoused values at least to the extent that they were. But one of the ways that I'm privileged is meeting people like you and so many extraordinary people all over the US, all over the world, in Israel, Palestine, who, for whatever reason, they don't accept the way the world the way the world is as it is. They believe it can be different, and they live differently into it. And they're everywhere. And so we know the name of Gandhi, for example, who went on this incredible internal process and then used this path of nonviolent resistance to, in South Africa and in India, to liberate India from its colonizers. And it's so profound, this action. And that's what I'm wrestling with for this final, not, this hopefully like this next chapters, I don't mean, hopefully I have many chapters left, knock on wood, but this final reflection is that I'm holding these two things in tension, is that this moment feels so particularly urgent. And so what I would say, as you do an analogy, that it's like, we're in a building together and the building next door is on fire. There are children dying. There's a gas tank in the basement. It's about to explode. If it blows, we all die. But half of us are sitting here pretending that nothing is happening, and the other half are sitting here arguing, well, who started it? Whose job is it to put it out? Who's going to be in control afterwards? I'm like, yeah, these are all really important questions. I don't want to diminish those questions, but we need to put the fire out. And, for me, it's like arms embargo for Israel, but I don't think that's going to happen, right? So like, what do we do? So I feel so frustrated in this moment because there's so many easy steps that could change the dynamic in important ways. And you may completely disagree with what I'm saying, but that's just where I am emotionally. But I think what I want to dive more into is this idea of being that drop. And for me, I've been writing a book, and I want to finish out how to finish that book. I think that these next years for me need to be about, as introverted as I am, sharing some of what I think I've learned, because I think this is what the human reality and the human experience is about. It's about connectivity. It's not about ego, that I own anything, any gift of knowledge, or anything, have any more proximity to the divine or than anyone else. It's recognizing that when we've been privileged to have these unique experiences, like I have, to know hundreds of truly extraordinary people around the world, that I have a responsibility to do to share what I believe that I've learned, and to enter into that public square with greater conviction, and not necessarily clarity. The two are not the same. Conviction is not clarity. Right now, we are in a time of real uncertainty. But I do believe, the analogy that you gave from Mother Teresa, the pure drops of water. I believe, in Mitri Rahed, saying that hope is what you do, or what my father, who was a theologian, would say. He would quote the psalmist and say, to seek peace and pursue it. But then he'd go on and say, is always the right thing to do, especially when it seems impossible. Because these times, whether they're good or not, these times shall pass too, and there will be new opportunities that we can't imagine. I want to leave with a very short poem, which for me is sort of like a calling for me and also for the listeners. It's from Hafez, the 14th century Sufi Muslim poet. He wrote, the fool builds cages for everyone he knows, while the sage, who has to duck her head when the moon hangs low, keeps dropping keys all night long for all the beautiful, rowdy prisoners. I love that so much because it reminds us in this stage of uncertainty that story is both cage and key, the stories that we tell, how we engage each other. And there are those who want to build their team, want to consolidate power, and they get that power by keeping us caged or in their cages. And yet, we have power too, and that's to drop keys, to keep turning towards each other, recognizing that there is a different way that we have not yet found or perfected yet. But we have these points of light, whether it's Gandhi or Mother Teresa or Dr. King from the future, but they're all around us today. They're you and me in various ways, people in our personal lives. And the key is to consistently turn towards each other, to recognize that my story is not the only story, that in fact our well-being is interdependent, and that our safety, our dignity, our agency is interconnected. And yes, there are people who want to do bad things in the world and are doing those bad things in the world, but as more of us continually turn towards each other instead of away from each other, we can chart a different path together. And I want to be part of that. As disheartened and disillusioned as I may feel today, I think that's the only way forward. And I think that we may be in for some very, very difficult years ahead that we cannot predict, but there will be a time after. And that's how we get to that time after. And that's how the time after looks better than anything the world has ever known before.
Wow, thank you. That is such a beautiful poem from Affairs, such a powerful flow of thoughts from you, and what a great quote from your father, seek peace and pursue it. especially when it seems impossible. Greg, I want to thank you on behalf of all who are going to be enjoying and getting inspiration from listening to everything that you've shared in not just the next few days, but I think in the months and years ahead, this podcast will live on. So I'm so grateful for your time, for your heartfelt spirit, and for living the truths you are and the nobility of the work that you're doing. And I know my listeners join me in wishing you Godspeed, wishing you a blessed holiday season. Wishing you great moments of attunement and inspiration as you continue the good work of writing this book. And we very much look forward to seeing what emerges from it. And the metaphor of the building of cages versus the handing over of keys was, I think, a really powerful way for us to end our conversation. So thank you for handing so many beautiful keys to so many of us.
Well, thank you, Hitendra. I look forward to much collaboration in the months and years to come.